Jesus was an Aramaic-speaking Jew of the Middle East, and the Assyrians are Aramaic-speaking Christians in the Middle East who have endured persecution for over 1,000 years. Join Voice of the Word Aramaic Bible teacher, artist, and author Stephen Missick as he examines the Bible through the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times in which it was first revealed. Research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the Church to its Semitic roots. And now, Voice of the Word.
Hello, I'm Stephen Missick, and I'd like to welcome you to the condensed version of the Aramaic School of the Bible. Later on, I'm going to do more extensive programs about each chapter of this series. But to begin with, let's go through the contents lecture by lecture. There's going to be 12 lectures. The first is on Aramaic as the language of Jesus and of the Assyrian Christians. The second chapter is Aramaic in the Old Testament and the Aramaic Targums. The third chapter is Aramaic version of the New Testament. The fourth chapter is how to study the Bible from the Aramaic perspective. The fifth chapter is the apostolic origins of the Assyrian Church. The sixth chapter is the Assyrian Church in China, Mongolia, and India. The seventh chapter is the Assyrian Church Fathers and the Desert Fathers. Chapter 8 is Aramaic spirituality, worship, and meditation. Chapter 9 is intercultural encounters between the East, West, and Africa through the Assyrians. The 10th chapter is about the persecution of Middle Eastern Christians, pre-Islamic and Islamic. The 11th chapter is current persecution of Assyrians from the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom until the present. The final chapter is about how to help persecuted Assyrians and refugees. So let's go on to the first lesson. I'm going to go through some important facts. First off is that the Holy Bible is written in 3 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Now, there are some important points to be made about the Aramaic language. First off, Hebrew and Aramaic are related Semitic languages, both developed independently from an extinct language that scholars call Proto-Semitic. Probably an example of this that people might be more familiar with would be the Romance languages. To just make this simple, we know that in times past Latin was spoken, but today Latin's no longer spoken, but you have languages that developed out of Latin, such as Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and some other languages like Romanian. So in a similar way, in ancient times, there's this Proto-Semitic language which went extinct in prehistoric times. But Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Ethiopian languages, Maltese, and Sakatri are languages that developed out of Proto-Semitic the way Romance languages developed out of Latin. So Hebrew did not come out of Aramaic. Aramaic is not a form of Hebrew. These are 2 languages that developed independently. For instance, you have Germanic languages. You have the maybe Dutch language is a Germanic language, and English is a Germanic language. But both of these languages developed independently, even though they're both Germanic languages, English and Dutch and German. These languages developed independently and aren't descended from each other. So this is the same way with the Semitic languages. And scholars can reconstruct Proto-Semitic by, we have ancient Akkadian writings, we have the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, we have modern Semitic languages like Maltese, Arabic, Tigrian, Amharic, and you compare all these languages, and so scholars are able to work backwards and to reconstruct the original languages that these languages developed out of. Greek is an Aryan language or an Indo-European language. Now, Aryan is just a term for nomadic people whose forefathers gave birth to Latin, Germanic, Slavic, a huge amount of languages today are Indo-European. It used to be called Aryan, but then there's nothing wrong with that term, so the Nazis misused it, so people like to say Indo-European instead. As the Aryan or Indo-European language, this means that Greek belongs to the same language family as Latin, Sanskrit, Russian, and Germanic languages such as English. So you have this huge language family called the Indo-European languages. Greek is an Indo-European language, as is English, Sanskrit, and Latin. Many languages of northern India are also. Persian is a Indo-European language, and Urdu, Pashto, languages like that are also Indo-European language. The earliest translation of the Bible is the Greek Septuagint Bible. It is made around the year 150 or so, perhaps earlier, in Egypt. This translation was accepted as the Bible of Greek-speaking Jews. Often the New Testament follows the reading of the Greek Septuagint Bible when it quotes from the Old Testament. Sometimes it follows the Hebrew Old Testament. Other times it follows the Aramaic Targum versions of the Old Testament. And in a later program, I'll talk more in depth about the Targums. But basically what happened is many Jewish people no longer spoke Hebrew, so the Bible was translated into Aramaic. Most of the Targums we have are dated to the time after the time of Jesus, but Targums were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which supports the fact that the Holy Land at the time of Jesus was mostly Aramaic speaking. The Holy Land at the time of Jesus is most likely trilingual, with Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek being spoken. The evidence indicates that Aramaic was the most widely spoken language in this region at that time, and would have been the primary spoken language of Jesus. Most likely Jesus spoke Aramaic, knew Hebrew, and also had some knowledge of Greek. That's what I believe. But what I will say is that based on what the Bible says, we know conclusively that Jesus spoke Aramaic, and we could theorize about the level at which he spoke Hebrew and Greek, although he probably spoke those two languages as well. Since most Jews at the time of Jesus did not know Hebrew, translations of the Bible into Aramaic were made. An Aramaic translation of the Old Testament is called a Targum. There's a tradition of Aramaic oral paraphrases of the Bible. As I mentioned, Targums are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and most of the Targums we have are not literal word-for-word translations. They're very interpretative. And as I mentioned earlier, most Targums were confined to writing decades or centuries after the time of Jesus, but even so, they may represent ancient traditions. All the books of the Bible, the Old Testament, were translated in Aramaic by the Jews into Targums, except Ezra and Daniel, which were partially written in Aramaic anyway. I think something that's also very important is it should be remembered that illiteracy levels in ancient times were very high. I would say at least 60%, but it's perhaps as high as 75 to 85% of men could not read or write. Now we live in a very prosperous society, and because of our wealth, we're able to have universal literacy rates of both men and women. But back in ancient times, very few men could read or write, and a woman, I'm sure there were some, but it's very, very rare to find a woman who was taught to read and write. Targums were recited orally in the synagogues after the Bible was read in Hebrew. According to the early church fathers, the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, but in certain places the church fathers clarify that when they say Hebrew, they mean the language we now call Aramaic. Eusebius makes that very clear that Aramaic is being spoken when he refers to the Hebrew language. When the early church fathers, sometimes when they say Hebrew, they mean the Aramaic dialect spoken by the Jewish people in the Holy Land. So they don't use the word Hebrew the way we do. And plus, Aramaic has gone through different names throughout history, such as Syriac and Chaldean. But really, those are other languages. But those words were used to describe Aramaic. The church fathers describe and quote from the Hebrew version of Matthew and other Jewish Christian Gospels. However, the Hebrew Matthew has been lost. Recently, some people were trying to pass off some polemical Hebrew Gospels as the actual original Hebrew version of Matthew. But if you read the Shem Tov Matthews, it's so obvious that they are medieval in origin, and they have so many Latin words in them that somebody took the Latin Vulgate and translated it into Hebrew. These Shem Tov Matthews were used in debates, Christianity or the Catholic Church versus Judaism. They would have these debates. Sometimes the Jews were compelled to go to these debates, and to prepare for the debates, some rabbis translated the Gospel of Matthew from Latin into Hebrew. And that's what these Shem Tov Matthews, Gospel Matthews are. And it's pretty obvious if you read it, you'll see so many Latin words that it must be the case. Plus, it also shows ignorance of the geography of the Holy Land that Matthew could not possibly have made, but a Jew living in Europe who'd never seen the Holy Land before or had an accurate map of the Holy Land would be bound to have made. The evangelist Luke, using Hebrew and Aramaic sources, composed his gospel and Acts in Greek. So what I'm saying here is that Matthew probably had an Aramaic origin, but Luke may have used Hebrew and Aramaic sources in composing the book of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. But he's writing in Greek. Paul also wrote in Greek to Greek-speaking communities he founded. So this means that the bulk of the New Testament is originally written in Greek. There could be exceptions, such as the Gospel of Matthew. There's a strong tradition that it was originally written in Aramaic. There may be other Aramaic sources in the New Testament, but all we really have is the Greek New Testament. Any Aramaic source of the text of the New Testament have been lost and have to be reconstructed theoretically. There's Maurice Casey, a biblical scholar in Great Britain, and he tried to reconstruct the Aramaic sources to the biblical text, the Gospels. But we have no ancient Aramaic text to go from. We do have Aramaic in the Gospels. We also have the Syriac Peshitta, which I will speak about in a moment. The Aramaic-speaking community is one of the oldest Christian communities in the world. The first translation of the Bible, or the New Testament, was made into the Aramaic language, into the Syriac dialect. The main Aramaic Bible is what's called the Syriac Peshitta. And I think this is important because we know Jesus spoke Aramaic, but as I mentioned, the New Testament is in Greek, but Jesus is quoted in the Greek of the New Testament speaking Aramaic repeatedly. There's a lot of Aramaic written in the Greek text. But we do have an ancient Aramaic Bible called and other Aramaic Bibles, by the way, called the Syriac Peshitta. So the Syriac Peshitta is important because it represents a translation of the Bible back into the language Jesus spoke, and it's also a very ancient translation. So it's important. The Old Testament of the Syriac Peshitta is a translation from the Hebrew, not the Greek Septuagint. It's kind of interesting. The Greek Septuagint became the Bible of many churches, especially the Greek Orthodox Church. And they would say, well, you know, the apostles in the New Testament quoted from the Septuagint, therefore it has apostolic authority, and this is the version of the Bible which we're going to recognize as the inspired text. And so they didn't use the Hebrew. And many churches, especially in the East, use the Greek Septuagint as the official version of the Old Testament. However, the Syriac Peshitta is not translated from the Greek Septuagint. It's translated directly by, probably by Christian Jews. The Hebrew and Aramaic of the Old Testament is translated into the Syriac form of Aramaic. So that's interesting that Aramaic Christians use a Bible that's translated directly from the Hebrew and not from the Greek. Now, the Greek Septuagint is very important, and I think serious Bible scholars should take a look at this Greek Septuagint, but of course, it's a translation, and sometimes it's necessary to go back to the original. One thing about St. Jerome I think that's interesting, when he translated the Latin Vulgate, he went to the Holy Land, he studied under rabbis, and he translated the Latin Vulgate directly from Hebrew and Aramaic as well. And another thing interesting about Jerome is he recognized the the Jewish people designated certain books as not part of their canon of Scripture, and these were deemed apocryphal. So Jerome translated from the Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin, and he also recognized that the Jews didn't have the same canon of Scripture. So during the Protestant Reformation, they kind of affirmed, Protestants affirmed Jerome's teaching that you have the Old Testament that the Jews used, and then we have these apocryphal books. So Protestants started taking the apocryphal books and placing them between the Old and New Testament, and then stopped printing them altogether, and they're very rarely used by Protestants today. But Jerome made that designation that many Protestants agree with today. Some scholars, as I mentioned before, argue that the Syriac Peshitta of the Old Testament is a Targum created by Christian Jews. The Syriac New Testament is a translation from the Greek into Aramaic. Very important that the language, the words of Jesus are being translated back into a form of the language he spoke. Peshitta primicists argue that the Syriac Peshitta New Testament is the original Semitic New Testament. They point to rhymes and word plays and places where the verses seem to work better in Aramaic. But to me, I think some of their points are interesting, but it proves what's already known, that Jesus spoke in Aramaic. So when you translate back into the language he spoke, of course you're going to find greater insight. But so those discoveries are interesting, but that doesn't change the fact that that the Syriac Peshitta is a translation from Greek into Aramaic. So I'm hesitant. The Syriac Peshitta is important enough as it is without making extraordinary claims for it. The Syriac Peshitta is important for several reasons. It is an ancient witness to the text of the New Testament, and is an ancient translation of the Bible. Also, as a translation of the words back into Aramaic, the language he spoke and taught in, it has obvious, tremendous value. And that being the case, you don't have to make claims, such as it's the original version of the New Testament, that aren't true. It stands on its own merits. The Syriac Peshitta also represents the Textus Receptus Bible. This is the traditional majority text in the New Testament, is represented by the Latin Vulgate and the King James Bible. I think that's very interesting. Growing up, you had these people who taught King James only. I love the King James Bible. It's my favorite translation of the Bible. I use it most often today. But as much as I love it, the important thing is for people to understand the Bible. And the reality is, people today, based on the decline of the quality of education, people have trouble understand the King James Bible. So number one thing is we need to have the Bible translated so people can read it and understand it. But people who argue how the King James is supposed to be superior, they talk about these other questionable texts out there. But the fact of the matter is, the King James version of the Bible, the Greek text underlining it, is the same textual tradition as the Syriac Peshitta Bible, and even the Latin Vulgate agrees with the King James Bible. As I mentioned earlier, there are other Aramaic versions of the New Testament. This includes the Old Syriac New Testament. The Old Syriac is represented by the Curetonian Gospels, and this Syriac Sinaitic, which is discovered by two British sisters in Mount Sinai. It's also known as the Syriac Palimpsest. That's because somebody erased the old Syriac Bible, and they wrote an Aramaic text over it of the teachings of Saint Ephraim the Syrian. So it's very interesting. They were able to look beyond the text and rediscover the old Syriac version of the Bible that was originally written on that manuscript. Other ancient Aramaic versions of the Bible include the Diatessaron of Tatian the Assyrian. Tatian the Assyrian was an Assyrian Christian who composed the first harmony of the four Gospels. Apparently he was bilingual. As an Assyrian Christian, he spoke Aramaic as his first language, but as a disciple of St. Justin Martyr, he also spoke Greek. So he composed the Diatessaron, his harmony of the four Gospels, in both Greek and in Aramaic. And that became so popular in the Middle East that the version of the Bible used by Assyrian Christians for quite some time was the Diatessaron of Tatian the Assyrian. But some church leaders thought that they were using that too much, so they repressed it and promoted the four Gospels. So we don't have an Aramaic version of the Diatessaron anymore. It exists in an Arabic translation from the Aramaic, but also there is a commentary by the aforementioned Ephraim the Assyrian that has survived. So we do have the commentary by Ephraim the Assyrian. We also have the Arabic translation from the Aramaic, but unfortunately the Diatessaron of Tatian the Assyrian is lost. There's also a Palestinian Syriac Bible is discovered in Jordan, I believe, but it's not in classical Syriac, but in a dialect of Aramaic spoken by Christians that lived in the Holy Land a couple of centuries after the time of Jesus. Christians in Europe have become familiar with the Syriac New Testament hundreds of years ago, and they included it in parallel Bibles called polyglots. The Complutensian Polyglot Bible included the Aramaic Targums. Translators of the King James Bible, as mentioned earlier, they claim that they also consulted the the Aramaic versions, and in the 1800s, translations of the Syriac Peshitta were made into English by James Murdoch, and another translation was made by John Wesley Etheridge. In the mid-20th century, or probably the early 20th century, Assyrian-American George Lamza popularized the Syriac Peshitta in America. I need to check and see when his translation. He died in this. George Lamza was an Assyrian Christian who came to America, and he translated the Bible again from Aramaic into English, and he wrote commentaries, which are very interesting and readable. But probably in the 50s and 60s, even though he got it started earlier than that, is when he started trying to popularize the Aramaic Bible. Now, in conclusion of this lesson, I want to look at Aramaic phrases in the New Testament, in the Greek New Testament. What we have, let's just go some of these words. This is not complete. I would say you probably have 30 to 50 or more Aramaic words, phrases, and figures of speech in the Greek New Testament. But let's look at some obvious ones here. This is Mark chapter 7:34. A lot of Aramaic words are found in the Gospel of Mark and also in the Gospel of John, interestingly enough. Some in Matthew. Now, Luke doesn't use Aramaic terms too much. He does in the beginning of the Gospel, the Acts of the Apostles. But let's look at these words found in the Greek New Testament. Apophatha, Jesus says this when he heals someone in Mark 7:34. It means to be open. In Mark 14:36, Yeshua says Abba, Father, which is Aramaic form. That's an Aramaic word that's made its way into Hebrew now. Israeli children will say Abba, meaning daddy. And Avi would be, father. But that's a Aramaic word, which Yeshua used in the Garden of Gethsemane, which Jesus used. The word raka, this is an Aramaic word found in the Gospel of Matthew 5:22. It's very interesting. It's not a Greek word. When Matthew was translated from Aramaic into Greek, whoever was doing that didn't know what was the equivalent word for raka in Greek, so they just left the Aramaic word as it was. So that's very interesting. In the middle of this passage, there's an untranslated Aramaic word. Most people think that raka means idiot or empty-headed, and Jesus is saying you shouldn't call people these words. Mammon, this is found in Luke, one of the rare Aramaic terms found in Luke, which is wealth personified, kind of a demon of wealth. John 20:16, also in the story of blind Bartimaeus found in the Gospel of Mark. In this passage, Mary of Magdala calls calls Jesus Rabboni. In 1 Corinthians 16:22, we find the word Maranatha, which means, it's clearly Aramaic for our Lord come. Jesus on the cross in Mark 15:34 says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is clearly Aramaic for, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think in Hebrew it would have been Eli, Eli, lama abazabtani. It's a different word altogether in the final part. So even in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is clearly speaking in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. Korban, this means a sacrifice. It's used in Matthew 27:6. Hosanna is probably an Aramaic form of a Hebrew word. When Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus, he says, Talitha kum, This is Mark 5:41, which is Aramaic for little girl, arise. Another interesting thing is names in the Greek New Testament. You have, Jesus calls James and John Boanerges in Mark 3:17, which means sons of thunder. Peter is the Aramaic form of the word Peter, which is Kepha, is used in John 1:24, 1 Corinthians 1:12, and Galatians 1:18. I think it's interesting that Paul calls Peter Kepha more than he calls him Peter, probably because he knew him personally, and that's the Aramaic form is what he went by, mostly. By a fellow Jewish Aramaic speaker like Paul is calling Peter by the Aramaic form of his name. Kepha means stone. Thomas is Aramaic, an Aramaic word meaning twin. It's used in all the Gospels, but in John 11:16, for instance. Tabitha means gazelle. That's used in Aramaic for gazelle, used in Acts 9:36. Other names like Bartholomew in Matthew 10:3, Bartolomai maybe, or it could be the son of Ptolemy or the son of the plowman. Matthew 16:17, Simon Bar-Jonah. Bar, in Hebrew you'd say Ben as son of, like in Ben-Hur, but in Aramaic you'd say Bar, like Bartholomew, Barnabas, Bar-Jonah, things like that. We see that the Aramaic form is used almost exclusively in the New Testament because that's just showing the Aramaic is spoken. Matthew 27:16, Barabbas, son of the Father. Mark chapter 10, verse 46, Bartimaeus, son of Timothy, or Timaeus. Acts 1:23, we got Barabbas, this is Barsabbas, the son of the Sabbath. In Acts 4:36, Joseph is called Barnabas, Barnava, meaning son of prophecy. Acts 13:6, you have Bar-Jesus. So names and nicknames and names that Jesus is giving to people are in Aramaic, not in Greek or Hebrew. It's because this is Jesus' native language. When he heals people, he's speaking Aramaic over them. When he calls somebody, he gives them a new name, like Kepha, or Boanerges, it's an Aramaic form. When he's on the cross crying out to God, when he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's crying out to God in Aramaic. When he's on the cross, he's crying out to God in Aramaic. So it's pretty indisputable, based on the evidence in the New Testament, is that Aramaic is the language of Jesus. Now, there's also place names. Gethsemane, most likely an Aramaic word. Matthew 26:36, meaning olive press. Golgotha, Aramaic for place of the skull. John 19:17. Bethsaida, fisherman's house. John 1:44. Gabbatha, clearly an Aramaic word for stone platform. John 19:13. Akeldama, field of blood. This is Acts 1:19, one of the few times where Luke uses an Aramaic word referring to the field of blood where that was purchased with the blood money of Jewish Iscariot. Also Bethsaida, which is a Aramaic word as well. Now, there are also other Aramaic expressions found in the New Testament besides the ones I've listed here, like Gehenna, which means burning hell. That's used often. Now, the expression which Jesus uses for himself most often is Son of Man, which is Barnash or Barnasha in Aramaic. And in the Aramaic portion of the book of Daniel, we see a cosmic, pre-existent Messiah, messianic figure who is called the Son of Man. Daniel sees a vision in the night. He sees the Ancient of Days, God the Father, and he sees one like this Son of Man. And the Son of Man comes and brings the kingdom of God to earth. This expression is also used in the Aramaic book of Enoch, which was preserved in Ethiopia and found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you have this messianic figure called the Son of Man. So this terminology, Son of Man, is an Aramaic figure of speech, but with this term, Jesus is identifying himself with humanity, but at the same time he's also identifying himself as Messiah, alluding to the prophecies of Daniel and prophecies found in the book of Enoch. So this will be the conclusion of episode 1. There are some other Aramaic expressions. What I want to look at in the following episode is Aramaic in the Old Testament and Jewish Aramaic. So hopefully you can join me next time, or just scroll down and find chapter 2 of Aramaic School of the Bible. I think this is very important because we're getting back to the roots of who Jesus, who Yeshua was, and what he did and said, and going to the direct source is how these words came out of his mouth. It's written in the Bible. These Aramaic words are found in the scriptures, so it wouldn't be in the Bible if it wasn't important. And I think we can learn a lot about Jesus by studying his language. And as I mentioned, this chapter is called Aramaic as the language of Jesus and of the Assyrians. Aramaic has not died out yet. It's still spoken by Assyrian Christians in the Middle East. But as I record this program, the future of Aramaic is in question because the global community has allowed ISIS to commit ethnic cleansing and genocide on the Assyrian people. Can the Assyrian people survive? Can Aramaic be maintained as a spoken language, this unbroken chain, speaking language of Jesus, which goes back to ancient times and is a living connection with the language of Jesus, the apostles? Can it survive in the future? Well, I hope so. And maybe through this program, we can make efforts to preserve Aramaic as a spoken language. So I'll be exploring these topics later on in this program, and I hope that you can join me. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Research, rescue, and restore. Help Voice of the Word and Aramaic Christian Ministries mission research the ancient languages, peoples, lands, cultures, and times of the Bible. Rescue persecuted Assyrian Christians in the Middle East and restore Christianity to its original Semitic roots. For Stephen Missick's books, online giving, and other resources from Aramaic Christian Ministries, visit www.stephenmissick.com. Join us next time on Voice of the Word as we research the Scriptures, rescue persecuted Christians, and restore the church to its Semitic roots.